Hey, it's Verity from the creative team and welcome back to the Wow Embossing Powder YouTube channel. In today's video I have 3 cards where we'll be creating dip dyed heat embossing, and it's such a fun and easy technique to do. As well, I'm sharing a few tips to help you along the way so you can easily try it out next time you're in your craft space. These cards also feature the fantastic trio from Wow Embossing Powder and Seth Apter called Cosmic, which has some lovely blue mixed embossing powders. So let's get crafting. For this first card, I have a piece of Gina K Ocean Mist cardstock, and I'm tearing the bottom of the card for a more organic look, as I want it to look like the card is a piece of scrap card that's literally been dipped in embossing powder. Now, here I'm showing you a mistake I made. So initially I applied the Wow Clear Ultra Slow Drying Embossing ink directly to the paper over the rough torn edge. However, I soon discovered that when I covered it in embossing powder and heat set it, I got a very rough texture to the heat embossing. This is because where I've torn the card, I've got a rough torn card fibres exposed, and I can't get a smooth embossed area. If you like this texture on your cards, by all means use this side, but I wanted a smoother look. So instead, after I'd torn the edge, I flipped my card over and then I used the side on the reverse because this is a much more smoother surface. It still has that organic torn shape to the edge, but it's lovely and smooth for the heat embossing. When applying the ink, just lightly swipe the pad over the edge. The lighter the better really. This is to prevent any harsh lines from the pad starting to show. So for this card I'm using the Sea of Tranquility from the Cosmic Trio set, and this pairs really well with the cardstock. As it heat sets you get a lovely turquoise mix and it's gorgeous. Now I've repeated the inking and adding heat embossing just to build up the embossed area, but you can stick with one application if you prefer. Once all the heat embossing was done, I felt I needed to blend the embossing powder in a little bit more. So to do this, I'm going to use Emboss Resist and help transition the ink from the powder to the card. Using my blending brushes, I'm just first starting off with Aquatini Catherine Paula ink and blending off the embossing powder and fading the colour out. To intensify the colour, I'm also going in with Daydream ink and I'm going back between the colours just to get a nice smooth blend. After this was complete, you get a lovely blend and transition from the embossing powder to the cardstock, really giving you that dip dyed look to the card panel. Okay, so we'll move on to the second technique, which is using the dip dyed look on layered die cut sentiments. And this is one of my favourite ways to step up your layered die cut sentiments. Here I've got the Altenew Fancy Thanks die, and I'm die cutting this out of Ocean Mist cardstock 3 times, and then I'm using my liquid glue to adhere these together to create that layered dimensional sentiment. Once my layered die cut is then assembled, I can then use my embossing ink to again use the direct to paper method to apply ink to the bottom half of the sentiment. Now don't worry if it's not perfectly straight. The more organic it will look, the better it will be. It just gives it a bit more of a dip dyed appearance. For this sentiment, I'm using the Space Dust embossing powder from the Cosmic Trio. It has a lovely blue and grey mix and it really pops off this light coloured cardstock when it's heat set. I find it useful to use my Tool-in-One tool from Spellbinders to hold the sentiment steady whilst I heat set it, just so that my heat gun doesn't blow my sentiment around my craft table really. Now you can leave it with just one layer of embossing powder and it will look great, but I always like to go back in and add a couple more layers of embossing powder for a smoother look. So for the final technique, we're going to add embossing powder to small die cuts to add a dip dyed look. And I have a few tips along the way to do this. So I'm using the Altenew Monstera 3D die, which is a layering die, and I'm going to add embossing powder to the smaller top layers of the dies. So first of all, we'll die cut all the pieces out of Ocean Mist cardstock again. But I wanted to add a little bit more colour to these pieces before I add the embossed pieces. So you may ask, why not do this before you do the die cutting? Well, I didn't want to add the shading in the same area on the card, as it's not going to fit in with all the different shapes and sizes of the die cuts. So the easiest way to add the ink is to do this after the die cutting. So once you've die cut it, keep your negative die cut piece, flip it over, and then use small pieces of purple tape to put on the back of the open spaces. Okay, so then once you've done that, flip it back over again, and you can insert one of your die cut pieces, and the tape just keeps it in place. Now you can ease the ink blend onto the die, as it's no longer fiddly and going to move about. So I'm using my blending brushes to apply the same colour of inks as before to these die cuts. Now what's great is that you can get these smaller ink blending brushes, allowing you to add ink to smaller areas to create shading in smaller areas. You may think I have quite a dark bit of ink to the top of this die cut, but I make sure that I add the ink off the die cut and move my brush inwards so that I don't get that big splodge of ink on the actual die. Then I go back in with my other colour just to blend it out, and as you remove the die cut, because it's so small, you're not going to notice if you do have any of the patchy blending. So it looks stunning. Okay, so for the heat embossing, these pieces are quite small and fiddly. So my tip is to get a piece of scrap card, apply some repositionable tape over the top, and then place your die cuts onto this tape. You've now got a larger surface area for you to hold to apply your embossing ink and cover with embossing powder, so it's much more easier to work with. So here I'm using the direct to paper method again, and I'm not necessarily worrying about getting a nice neat line, because remember, the more natural it is, the more organic it is, more realistic it will look. So the embossing powder here I'm using is Blue Moon powder from the Cosmic Trio, and it has a lovely shade of dark blues with some clear powder mixed into it as well. And once they're all heat set, I'm then just adding small pieces of 3D adhesive foam pads behind the die cut, just to layer it up onto the lower layer die cut, and it just adds more dimension. And I just love how these look once finished, with all that texture and interest from the ink blending as well as the embossing. Okay, so just to assemble all of these cards, for the first card I have die cut the Heffy Doodle Thanks out of white card and layered this up 3 times. But I wanted to add some more sparkle and interest to the sentiment, so I've added clear hologram sparkle from white embossing powder over the top, just to add that touch of sparkle. This embossed panel was then foam mounted onto a white card base before the sentiment was added, and I've stamped a sentiment from the Altenew Hello Hug stamp set in Hero Art soft granite ink, which was then trimmed down and foam mounted onto the card panel. For the embossed sentiment, I have used the Altenew pressed leaf die on a white card panel. So this does not necessarily cut the whole of the leaf design out, but partially cuts the leaves for texture. The panel was foam mounted onto the card base made out of Gina K sea glass cardstock, and I've added a few foam pads behind the leaves to add definition, and you just see that colour of cardstock pop through. Just remember not to put any foam pads behind the leaves where the sentiment actually sits. And then I've just adhered the layered sentiment to the front, keeping it quite simple, with this as being the only sentiment on the card. Now for the last card, I've stamped the Altenew Pinstripe background in Catherine Pooler Mint to be ink, and I've trimmed this down to adhere it onto a card base, again made out of sea glass cardstock. To create the scene, I've just positioned a few of the leaves temporarily just to determine where to add the pot, and I'm foam mounting the pot onto the card. I can then use liquid glue to adhere the leaves down, slotting them into the pot just to create a lovely little scene. Now another sentiment from the Hello and Hug stamp set was then also trimmed down and adhered to the front of the card. All 3 of these cards were finished off using some of my new favourite sequins from Lucy's cards, using Gina K Connect glue and my pickup tool to adhere them down. So these sequins are the Sprinkles Big Dots sequins, and I love the iridescent colours they have. I think they go so well with this colour scheme of the cards. I had so much fun making these cards and I love how they turned out. And the Cosmic Trio had such beautiful colours. But then blue is my favourite colour, so perhaps I'm a little bit biased there. So do you like the dip dyed look? Will you be giving it a go? Let me know, and I'd also love to know what is your favourite card. Just pop a comment down below. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up and why not subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit that bell icon to be notified when the next video is up. If you'd like to check out my personal channel, Pretty Little Button, I've also included a link here as well as down below. And why not check out this other video for some more inspiration. Until next time, happy crafting!